Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. No matter how profound and illogical the biblical stories are, some people believe that the stories were real historical events. The Bible stories were never written as literal in the first place, and in not understanding the origins behind the stories, this literal view causes so much confusion and conflicts within religions. There is a deeper interpretation that connects all religions, a foundation upon which all religions share. This is the premise from which ancient myths were derived. These are the celestial observations that manifested itself into the Bible. The numbers in the Bible are very significant and reveal an esoteric understanding of the stories and events. In this video, we will explore the number 40, which is used over 150 times in the Bible and tends to be used in a very repetitive way, an indication that it was not meant to be used as literal. Let's take a closer look at the number 40 in the Bible. In relation to water, rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights during the flood. Noah waited for 40 days after the tops of mountains were seen after the flood, before releasing a raven. In the Torah, the ritually impure are submersed in 40 measures of water. Once out, they are ritually pure. Thus, the earth being covered in water for 40 days in the story of Noah is symbolic of the earth being ritually purified. In a confrontation setting, the giant Goliath challenged the Israelites for 40 days before David defeated him. The first three kings over the children of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, each ruled for 40 years. After the kingdom split into two separate pieces, King Joash served 40 years from the age of 7 years old. Judges who served 40 years include Deborah, Othniel, and Barak. Both Isaac and Esau got married at the age of 40. On a mountain setting, Moses spent 3 consecutive periods of 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai. The prophet Elijah had to walk 40 days and 40 nights before arriving at Mount Horeb. Elijah remained 40 days on the Mount Carmel. In relation to sin, the prophet Jonah warned Nineveh for 40 days that its destruction would come because of its many sins. The prophet Ezekiel laid on his right side for 40 days to symbolize Judah's sins. Abraham tried to bargain with God to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their sinful ways if 40 righteous people were found. Stories about fasting in wilderness or desert settings are also significant in the Bible. Elijah fasted for 40 days before beginning his public ministry. Moses' life is divided into 3 40-year segments: growing up in Egypt, fleeing from Egypt, and his return to lead his people to the Promised Land. It took 40 years for Moses to walk the Israelites through the wilderness to the Promised Land. This is a 315-kilometer journey, which should have taken approximately 11 days if the story is literal. Jesus appeared to his disciples and others for 40 days after his resurrection from the dead. Jesus fasted and was tempted by the devil in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. There are many other stories relating to the number 40 in the Bible. In fact, across all religions, including Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, etc., the use of the number 40 is very significant. In studying Christian literature, they don't appear to have any real reason or understanding of the use of this number in their own sacred texts. There are three main arguments for the consistent use of the number 40 throughout the Bible, two of which are from Christian apologists. One, it is a literal indication of time and should be read in that context. Therefore, Moses and the Israelites, they actually believe, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Two, it is symbolic and simply means a long period of time. Given that the authors of the Bible use quite specific ages in chronologies and lifespans of people, it's hard to believe that they could not be bothered to use a specific time period for each significant event rather than simply use the number 40, if the stories were true. The third argument is the one that most Bible defenders choose not to accept, but is the most historically proven, accurate, and convincing for those who want facts and not faith, and study around the Bible and understand the origins of the myths, stories, and events on which the Bible is constructed on, namely celestial observation and solar symbolism. Let's explore this point in more detail and break down the origins of the biblical number 40 in 3 stages following my AMB principle. For those not familiar with astrotheology, I will simplify it, but the concept is very easy to grasp and the true origins of the Bible stories will slowly be revealed. 40 relates to the time interval of the sun in between the equinoxes and the sun's effect on the weather condition during those 40 days. The sun is moving out of the cold of winter towards the equator. After 6 months of being below the equator, the sun is now in position when it reaches the vernal equinox on March the 21st to bring a change of season and warmth to the northern regions. For 40 days during this seasonal change, there is a tug of war between the forces of light and heat versus the darkness and cold, of agriculture fertility versus sterility. 40 days after March the 21st is May Day, the 1st of May. The tug of war is over and the heat of the sun fully overcomes the cold of winter. The public holiday we take for granted, May Day, is a pagan holiday to celebrate this very movement and effect of the sun transitioning between spring and summer once a new equinox or solstice has been crossed. Ancients made stories, myths out of this astrological event, where Horus, representing the sun and light, and Set, representing darkness and the desert, had this same celestial tug of war. The myths were simply a way to convey this seasonal climate struggle, represented by Horus overcoming Set, light overcoming darkness, heat overcoming the cold. The pagan god Set is known as the Lord of the Desert. Thus, this 40-day conflict was in a desert or wilderness setting. It is simply mythology, no different to Greek or Roman mythology. Remember that these celestial observations and myths existed thousands of years before any religion was created. 40 days was the length of time in Egypt that was reckoned for the grain in the earth before it sprouted visibly from the ground. It was a time of scarcity and fasting in Egypt, which gave a very natural significance to the season of Lent, with its mourning for the dead Osiris and its rejoicing over the child of promise, the germinating green shoot springing forth from the earth. This was represented in the Gospel as a fast of 40 days and 40 nights, during which Jesus wrestled with the devil and was hungry. Jesus is no different to the pagan gods that preceded him, and they too fasted and were tempted in the wilderness. The myth of Horus versus Seth did not stop there. The Mexican pagan god Quetzalcoatl that predates Jesus was named the Morning Star. He too was tempted and fasted for 40 days. Zoroaster was tempted by the devil in the wilderness. Buddha was tempted by the devil in a wilderness. In doing so, they teach us that this temptation myth between Satan and Jesus represents the personification of the ancient struggle between light and dark, day and night, winter and summer. 40 is a mystical number signifying some sort of trial, testing, transition period, and spiritual growth. However, in the Bible, it is always 40 days or 40 years, never 40 weeks. The biblical authors retold the myths with a literal interpretation placed on it. We know that there are many parallels between Jesus and the pagan god Horus, and the authors retold and rewrote the Horus and Seth myth as Jesus and Satan in the wilderness for 40 days. With Israel, it was 40 years in the wilderness, and with Noah, it was 40 days of torrential rains. But regardless, the symbology is the same, and the origins of its use is astrological and astronomical in nature. All major fundamental versions of religions on the planet can be traced back to celestial worship, every single one of them. It's simply veiled in allegory or symbolic characters and stories used to convey a deep spiritual truth. Christians use words like paganism and astrology as if these are bad or negative, but they do this through sheer ignorance or fear in exposure of their religious origins. Astrology survives in our Western culture because Christianity embraced it in one hand, whilst condemning it as devilish in the other. A belief in the literal truth of Christian doctrine has become untenable for those who scrutinize the purported factual and historical content of the biblical texts. Just take a closer look at the stained glass windows in a church, or the symbols used in churches to understand the church's origins. I will cover this in a separate video.